The detective who came to my door that Tuesday morning was a patient man. I could tell he was patient because he had the specific stillness of someone who has heard many explanations of many situations and has learned that rushing the explanation rarely helps anyone. He stood on my front porch in a grey sport coat with a notepad, and he listened to me talk for about 4 minutes, and then he looked past me at the empty pool in my backyard, and then he looked back at me and said, in a very measured voice, "So this is your pool." He looked at his notepad, he looked at the pool, he looked at me, and he said, "I'm going to need to see the deed." That is where this story starts, in the most precise sense. But where it actually starts is about 14 months earlier, and that beginning involves a property purchase, a title search, and a woman named Carol Deming who had been telling people in the Westbrook neighborhood of Overland Park, Kansas for 2 years that she owned a pool that she had never owned, had never paid for, and had no legal claim to whatsoever. My name is Sarah Kowalski. I am 35 years old, I am a high school chemistry teacher, and I bought my house at 18 Primrose Court in a subdivision called Westbrook Gardens 14 months before the detective showed up on my porch. I bought it because it had 4 bedrooms, a good yard, a recently updated kitchen, and a pool. The pool was one of the main reasons I bought it. I have always loved swimming, and I had been in apartments and smaller houses for the previous 8 years of my adult life, and the pool was, in my mind, the thing that made this house the house. I did a full inspection. I had an independent inspector go through the house and a pool specialist assess the pool. The pool was in good structural condition but needed resurfacing. The plaster coating was approaching the end of its life and would need to be replaced within a year or two. The seller disclosed this. We negotiated a credit on the purchase price to account for the resurfacing cost. I closed in October, moved in, used the pool through the end of the season, and planned the resurfacing for the following spring. What I did not know when I bought the house, and what I would not learn until the detective showed up with his notepad 14 months later, was that my immediate neighbor, a woman named Carol Deming who lived at 20 Primrose Court, had been telling everyone she encountered that the pool at 18 Primrose Court belonged to her. Not that she had access to it, not that she had an easement or a shared use agreement, that she owned it, that it was her pool on her land, and that the people living next door had been using it improperly for years. Carol Deming was 67, retired from a career in insurance underwriting, and had lived at 20 Primrose Court for 16 years. She was the kind of neighbor who had strong opinions about the properties around her, including opinions about things that were not her property. She had been on the HOA board for 4 of those 16 years and had served on the architectural committee. She knew the neighborhood in the detailed way of someone who had made it her business to know it, and somewhere in those 16 years she had developed a belief about the pool at 18 Primrose Court that was not supported by any legal document anywhere, but that she held with the certainty of a person who has repeated something to themselves often enough that the repetition has become the evidence. Here is what I believe happened, though I want to be clear that this is my reconstruction from conversations and documents, and not something I have direct proof of in every detail. The pool at 18 Primrose Court was built in 1998 by the original owners, a couple named the Hendersons who lived there from 1992 to 2007. In the early years after the pool was built, Carol and the Hendersons apparently had a neighborly arrangement where Carol could use the pool on certain days. This was informal. It was never written down. It was the kind of arrangement neighbors make when they get along and they have something useful between them. The Hendersons sold the house in 2007 to a family named the Okafor-Williamses, who had 3 children and who used the pool themselves, and who either did not know about or did not continue the informal arrangement with Carol. There was apparently some friction. The Okafor-Williamses lived there for 9 years, and during that time, Carol's relationship with the pool, in her own mind, based on conversations she apparently had with several neighbors, shifted from she used to be able to use it to she should still be able to use it to the pool should rightfully be hers. By the time the Okafor-Williamses sold in 2016 to a woman named Janet Pruitt, who lived alone and who allowed Carol to use the pool occasionally. Carol had apparently internalized a version of history in which the pool had always been connected to her property in some meaningful way. When Janet sold to me in the fall of my purchase year, Carol's mental ledger had a line item that said pool at 18 Primrose belongs to me, or at minimum belongs adjacent to me, in a way that requires my approval for anything that happens to it. I did not know any of this. Carol introduced herself to me shortly after I moved in, brought over a plate of cookies, seemed pleasant, and made a comment about the pool that I interpreted at the time as neighborly familiarity, and which I now understand was something more like a landlord commenting on a tenant's decorating choices. She said something like, "I do hope you'll take good care of the pool. It's been such a lovely feature of this part of the court." I said I planned to. We moved on. Over the following months, I had a few brief interactions with Carol. She mentioned the pool twice more in passing. Once when she saw me cleaning the filter housing and said that she had always maintained it on a quarterly schedule, which I found slightly puzzling. And once when I was shopping for pool chemicals and she appeared at the supply store and offered unsolicited advice about which brand she preferred. I chalked both of these up to a woman who had spent a lot of time paying attention to a pool next door and had developed opinions about it. I did not think much more about it. In April, I scheduled the resurfacing. I had gotten 3 quotes. The company I chose, a pool service company called Blue Water Restoration, was licensed, insured, had good reviews, and gave me a clear project timeline. The resurfacing required draining the pool, which I did on a Friday afternoon with the pool pump running to the backyard drainage channel the previous owners had installed specifically for that purpose. By Sunday morning, the pool was empty. Carol knocked on my door Sunday at 10 a.m. She was not carrying cookies this time. She was carrying a file folder, and she had an expression I had not seen on her face before. A kind of compressed determination that I recognized from parents at school conferences who have decided what the outcome of the meeting should be before they arrive. She said, "I need to talk to you about the pool." I said, "Sure, what's up?" She said, "You drained it." I said, "I'm having it resurfaced. The plaster was at the end of its life. I got a credit for it at closing." She said, "You should have talked to me first." I looked at her. I was holding a cup of tea, and I was in my weekend clothes, and I was not prepared for this particular direction of conversation. I said, "Talk to you about what?" She opened the folder. She had papers in it. She held out the top sheet. It was a hand-drawn diagram of what appeared to be a property map of the 2 lots at 18 and 20 Primrose Court. The pool was drawn on it in a position that straddled the property line. In Carol's diagram, approximately a third of the pool was on her property. I looked at this diagram for a moment, then I looked up at her. I said, "Where did this come from?" She said, "I drew it, based on my measurements." I said, "Carol, the pool is entirely on my property. I had it inspected. It was disclosed in my title search. It's in my deed." She said, "I believe your deed has an error." I want to describe what it felt like to stand in my doorway on a Sunday morning hearing those words, because the feeling is worth describing. It was not anger. It was a specific form of disorientation, the feeling of someone handing you a map of a place you live and telling you the map shows it somewhere else and expecting you to accept the map. I had bought this house. I had done my due diligence. I had an inspection and a title search and a deed and a closing and a survey on file with the county. And my neighbor was standing on my porch with a hand-drawn diagram and telling me my deed had an error. I said, "Carol, I'd like you to leave. I'm going to make some calls." She said, "I think we should discuss this." I said, "I'll be in touch." She left. I went inside. I called my real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Holmes, same Patricia from an earlier story, different client. Patricia is a very good attorney who stays busy, and left a message explaining the situation. Then I pulled out my closing documents and found my title insurance policy and my survey, and I sat at my kitchen table and read through them. The survey showed the pool fully within my lot boundary. The setback from the property line on the north side, which was the side adjacent to Carol's property, was approximately 7 feet. The pool was entirely on my land. Every document I had said exactly the same thing. Patricia called me back that afternoon. I told her the full story. She said two things. First, that a hand-drawn diagram by a neighbor was not a competing survey and had zero legal standing. Second, that I should get a licensed surveyor to restake my corners immediately so that the current boundary was on fresh legal record, because if this situation developed further, I wanted absolutely current documentation. I hired a surveyor that week. He came out Thursday, set new corner monuments, and confirmed the boundary. The pool was entirely within my lot. The setback from Carol's property line on the north side was 6 feet 11 inches. Not a millimeter of the pool was on Carol's land. I sent Carol a letter through Patricia explaining this and attaching the new survey. The letter was courteous and clear. It noted the results of the licensed survey, referenced the deed and title search, and asked her to confirm in writing that she had no claim on my pool or my property. Carol did not respond to the letter. She also did not acknowledge it to my face. For 2 weeks she was politely, consistently, deliberately normal in the few interactions we had. She waved from her driveway. She said good morning over the fence. She behaved exactly like a neighbor who had not just shown up at my door with a hand-drawn property claim. It was the most unsettling version of normal I had encountered. Blue Water Restoration started the resurfacing on the Monday of week 3. They had equipment in the backyard, the empty pool was primed, and the work was underway. I had taken the day off from school to be home for the start of the project. At 11:15 a.m. on that Monday, there was a knock at my front door. I opened it. There were 2 uniformed police officers and Detective Ray Calloway in his gray sport coat on my porch. Behind them, standing at the end of my front walk, was Carol Deming with her file folder. Detective Calloway introduced himself and said he was sorry to bother me, but they had received a report about property damage and unauthorized alteration of disputed property, and he needed to ask me a few questions. I looked at Carol at the end of my walk. She was looking at the front of my house with an expression that I can only describe as proprietary. I said, "Come in, detective." He came in. His 2 officers waited on the porch. I walked him to the kitchen table, and I put my closing documents and my survey and Patricia's letter and the surveyor's report in front of him in a neat stack, and I told him everything I just told you. He listened. He looked at the documents. He went outside and looked at the pool where the Blue Water crew had paused their work. He measured the distance from the pool edge to the north fence with his own tape measure. He came back inside. He said, "This is your pool." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you drained it." I said, "I am having it resurfaced. Here is the contract with Blue Water Restoration, signed 3 weeks ago, with the scope of work and the payment schedule." He looked at the contract. He made some notes. Then he went back outside and had a conversation with Carol that I could not hear from inside. The conversation lasted about 6 minutes. Carol did at one point raise her voice, not dramatically but perceptibly, and produce papers from her folder. The detective looked at them. I watched from the kitchen window. He came back in. He said, "Your neighbor has a document she says shows an agreement from 1999 giving her shared access to and maintenance responsibility for this pool." I said shared access is not ownership, and even if such an agreement existed between her and the original owners, it was not disclosed in my title search and was not in the chain of title. It would not be binding on me as a subsequent purchaser without disclosure. He looked at me. I said, "I'm sorry, my attorney explained this to me. I have her number if you want to call her." He said that won't be necessary. He closed his notepad. He said he was not going to take any action because there was no evidence of property damage or criminal conduct, and the property ownership question was clearly established by the documented record. He said that if my neighbor believed she had a legal claim, she should pursue it through civil court. Then he said, quietly before he left, "Your neighbor told me she's been telling people she owns that pool for about 6 years." I said, "I'm starting to understand that." He shook his head slightly in the way of a man who encounters a particular kind of situation often enough to recognize it immediately. He thanked me for my time and went to collect his officers. I watched him talk to Carol on the front walk for another minute. Carol's body language changed during that conversation. The compression and determination came out of her posture, and what was left was something smaller and older. I went back inside and called Patricia. Patricia's first response when I described the morning was a brief silence, and then a very specific sigh that I had come to understand meant she was not surprised, but was recalibrating for the particular shape of the problem. She said she called the police. I said she called the police. She said and showed them a 1999 agreement. I said that's what the detective said. Patricia said, okay, here is what we need to do, and here is what we need to understand first. The first thing we needed to understand was what the 1999 document actually said. If Carol had a document from 1999 referencing some agreement about the pool, that document existed and had some content, and Patricia wanted to know what the content was before we did anything else. She said she was going to send a formal written request to Carol asking for a copy of the document under the principle that if Carol intended to assert a property claim based on it, we were entitled to know its contents. The second thing we needed to do was run a comprehensive title search, not the standard search that had been done at closing, which covered the typical scope, but a deep search going back to the original pool construction in 1998 to look for any recorded easements, agreements, or encumbrances that might have been recorded against the property and that a standard search might have missed. Patricia had a title company she trusted for exactly this kind of work. The third thing was to consult with my title insurance company, because if there was a document that had not been discovered in the original title search that was now being used to assert a claim against my property, that was potentially a title insurance matter. I authorized all three. Patricia moved quickly, which is one of the things I valued about her. The written request to Carol for a copy of the 1999 document produced a response through Carol's own attorney. She had hired one, a general practice attorney in Overland Park named Douglas Ferris, within a week. The document was attached to Douglas's letter. It was a one-page typewritten agreement dated July 1999, signed by the then owner of 18 Primrose Court, a Robert Henderson, and by Carol Deming. The document said that Carol had contributed to the cost of certain pool equipment, specifically the pump and filter system installed in 1999 to upgrade from the original equipment, and that in exchange for this contribution, she was granted shared maintenance responsibility and shared access to the pool. Patricia read it and said, okay, this is real, but it is not what she says it is. She walked me through it. The document granted Carol shared access, not ownership or shared ownership. It was a contractual agreement between Carol and Robert Henderson, the individual, not a recorded easement against the property. To be binding on subsequent owners of 18 Primrose Court, it would have needed to be recorded with the county as an easement, covenant, or lien against the property. It had not been recorded. It was a private contract between two individuals, and it had died with Robert Henderson's ownership of the property. When the Hendersons sold the house in 2007, any unrecorded personal agreement they had with Carol did not transfer to the new owners. The deep title search confirmed this. No easement, no covenant, no recorded agreement of any kind related to pool access or shared pool interests appeared anywhere in the chain of title for 18 Primrose Court going back to 1992. Patricia sent Douglas Ferris a letter laying all of this out with citations to Kansas property law on the recording requirements for easements and the effect of unrecorded agreements on subsequent purchasers. The letter was thorough and, I thought, rather elegant in the way it assembled a complete picture. It concluded by noting that Carol had no legal claim to my pool, that the 1999 agreement was a private contract that had no effect on current ownership, that Carol's conduct in calling the police and asserting ownership had caused me real inconvenience and distress, and that if Carol wished to avoid further legal proceedings, she should sign an acknowledgement that she had no claim on my pool or my property. Douglas Ferris responded 2 weeks later. He had done his own research. His letter was shorter than Patricia's and had the specific brevity of a letter written by someone who has reviewed the law and understands that his client's position is not good. He said that his client maintained that the 1999 agreement represented a legitimate interest, but that she was willing to discuss resolution in a manner that avoided costly litigation for both parties. The resolution conversation took 3 meetings. I was on the phone for all of them but did not speak. Patricia and Douglas worked through it. Carol's position, at its most reduced, was that she wanted acknowledgement that the 1999 agreement had been real and that she had contributed to the pool equipment, and that this contribution deserved some recognition even if the legal claim did not hold up. She was not, Douglas eventually made clear, truly expecting to prevail on an ownership claim. She had known for some time, I think, that she did not own the pool. What she had was 16 years of connection to it, a genuine financial contribution in 1999, and a story she had been telling herself and others that had gotten bigger and more fixed over time, until calling the police had seemed like a reasonable thing to do. Patricia said to me in private, "What do you actually want out of this?" I said I wanted the signed acknowledgement. I wanted Carol to sign a document stating clearly that she had no legal claim to my pool, my property, or any access to my property, so that when I eventually sold the house, this would not surface again to complicate the title. Patricia said, "Is there anything you're willing to give her in exchange for that?" I thought about it for a long time. 14 months of ownership, 2 police officers on my porch, a detective with a notepad, a hand-drawn map, 6 years of a story being told around the neighborhood about a pool that was mine. I said nothing financial, but if she signs the acknowledgement and it is recorded against the title, so it is on the public record. I am willing to write her a letter for her own files acknowledging that she contributed to pool equipment in 1999. Not a legal document, not an agreement about anything, just a letter acknowledging a fact. Patricia took this to Douglas. Douglas took it to Carol. Carol signed the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was recorded with the Overland Park Title Office. It is now in the chain of title for 18 Primrose Court, a recorded document stating that Carol Deming has no claim of any kind to the pool or property at that address. Any title search going forward will find it. Any buyer, any lender, any title company will see it. I sent Carol the letter. 1 paragraph, factual, acknowledging that she had contributed financially to pool equipment in 1999 under an agreement with the then owners. Nothing about access, nothing about maintenance, nothing that could be construed as any kind of current arrangement, just the fact. She sent me a note back, 3 sentences. She said she appreciated the letter. She said she was sorry for how things had developed. She said she hoped the resurfacing went well. It was the most Carol had ever said to me that was completely straightforward. The resurfacing was finished in 10 days. Blue Water Restoration did excellent work. The new plaster is a deep blue aggregate finish called Midnight that I had been looking at samples of for months, and that in the afternoon light is honestly one of the most beautiful things I have put in my life. I filled the pool on a Thursday and had the water balanced by Friday. I swam Saturday morning before the heat of the day arrived. The first lap in the newly resurfaced pool, the water clear and cool and perfectly mine. My neighbor on the other side, a woman named Grace Kim, who had lived at 16 Primrose Court for 8 years and who had been watching the whole situation with the quiet attention of someone who already knew the history, came over the following weekend to see the finished pool. She stood at the edge of the deck looking at the water. She said, "It looks wonderful." I said, "Thank you, a lot of work to get here." She said, "More than the resurfacing." I said, "Yes." She said, "Carol told me for years that pool was partly hers." I said, "I know." She said, "I always thought that was strange because I remembered when it was built. I was here. The Hendersons had it built. Carol was just the neighbor." I looked at the water. The afternoon light was on it. in a way that made it look like something that had always been there and always would be. I said she made a story out of a memory, and then she lived in the story long enough that she forgot it was a story. Grace thought about this, then she said, "How do you know the difference when you're in it?" I said, "You read the documents." She laughed. She stayed for a glass of iced tea on the deck, and we watched the light move on the water and talked about other things entirely. The pool is full. The new plaster is settling and curing the way plaster does, each day getting a little whiter and more finished at the edges. I swim in it most mornings. I have friends over on weekends. I host a cookout at the end of summer where half the neighborhood comes, and the pool is the center of everything, as pools in Kansas summers tend to be. Carol Deming waves from her driveway when I pull in. I wave back. We are neighbors. The acknowledgement is filed with the county. Everything is documented. The pool is mine. On the Friday after the pool was finished, I came home from school and changed, and swam for an hour in the late afternoon. The water the perfect temperature that pools reach in July when they have been in the sun all day. And I lay on my back in the middle of it looking up at the Kansas sky, and I thought about the detective with his notepad and the two officers on the porch, and Carol with her folder and her 16-year story. And I thought about a one-page typewritten agreement from 1999 that had not been recorded and had not been disclosed and had grown in Carol's mind from a summer arrangement between neighbors into something she had called the police about. People do that. They build stories out of small true things, and then they live in the stories until the stories feel like deeds, like surveys, like recorded legal documents. They feel so true that you call the police.